Uh-oh. Nothing. Hey guys, it's Russell back. And on today's video, we have a problem with the Jetta. The Jetta won't start. It won't crank. It's been sitting here for several months. It will not crank over. Now, the reason is because I have, excuse me, I have not had time to mess with it. I've been driving the Mercedes and it's been doing awesome, but won't crank over. First it was intermittent. It's been intermittent for several years, and then all of a sudden it just will not crank over. So I'm going to show you how to quickly diagnose this to kind of get a ballpark of what it is. I have already removed the bezel, plastic bezel cover here. I made sure that the harness on the back of the ignition switch was nice and tight. It was. And what's the next step? Well, I'm going to show you. Part of the safety system in a manual transmission car is that the car clutch must be depressed before it will crank over. So we will do this again. Nothing. Okay, now what you can do is, and I've already removed the plastic shield here, there's a connector right here. This is the clutch interlock harness, and up in there, if you can see that green switch right there. All right, that has to, basically tells the ignition that the clutch is depressed and to start. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take this little jumper that I made. I'm going to jump this. Okay, so once I do that, I'm bypassing that switch. Now if this starts with this bypassed, then that tells me the problem is the clutch switch. So I'm not going to apologize for the shaky camera. You guys know I'm doing this by myself. All right, so now with that bypass, I don't even have to push the clutch in. Just in case it starts, I'm going to make sure it's in neutral. Okay, and we will, nothing. Nothing. All right, so that's telling me that it's not the switch, and it's definitely not coming from the harness, right? So if you want to test it another way, and I'm going to move the camera here in just a minute so you can see what I'm doing. You can take that jumper out. I'm going to hook my test light to a ground, and I have this probe right here. When the ignition is turned, then if there is power going to the harness, all right, so this is how I have it. I've got the probe there and I've got it to a ground there. If the power is going to the harness at all, then this light will light up. Okay, there's nothing. Let me see if I can get the camera on there. This is very difficult with one hand. Okay, here we go. I'm going to turn the ignition switch. Okay, no light lights up. If you want to try the other side of the switch, you can do so. There'll be a light inside this tester that will illuminate. Nothing. All right, so unfortunately, since it failed both of those tests, we are 99% certain that it's the ignition switch inside of here. Now, to remove the ignition switch inside of here is pretty much a pain in the butt. But I'm going to do it. I'm going to set the camera up outside and point it here and let you see the procedure. The very first procedure that we want to do is we want to disconnect the battery. All right, I'm going to use a 10mm ratchet to disconnect the negative battery terminal, and the reason that we're doing this is because we're going to be removing the airbag, and I don't want any chance of the airbag going off when we're messing with it. All right, next I'm going to use a 5mm hex bit. There are 2 bolts on the back of the steering wheel that hold the airbag to the steering wheel. Okay, when they're loose, the airbag should come free from the wheel. Now be very careful, because there's a connector. I'll show you this. It's a yellow electrical connector. And just use something to pry it up. Okay. And then the airbag comes loose just like this. All right, now there is a large bolt in the center of the steering wheel that I'm going to have to remove. Now, I already have made sure that the steering wheel is centered, and I'll show you this bolt. Okay, so there's the connector for the airbag, and there's the 24mm bolt. Just to save time, I'm going to use my impact gun to zip it off. All right, so on the wheel, I can't get this to focus. You can see a slot on the steering wheel right there, and then a dot. And then there's one more connector right there on the back I'm going to need to disconnect. Now make sure that you do not move this clock spring around. Okay, this is designed to turn with the steering wheel, and you want to leave it alone. Okay, don't sit there and spin it around, because it's wound a certain number of times where it won't bind. This tab right here doesn't move, but I'll show you the line in the steering wheel. See that right there? That vertical slash lines up with that dot right there on the collar. Now what I'm going to do, and what I want you to be able to see, is that dot in the collar lines up with the slash right there on the steering shaft. So next, what I'm going to do is I'm going to remove these 3 screws here to remove this electrical assembly. All right, let's remove these 3 screws. Now, prior to removing this, there's a electrical connector here that I'll unplug. Okay, and that just slips off. And there's one on this side. Just like that. Okay, so there's one connector here. There's one set of connectors here. Another set of connectors here. All right, so after all the connectors, there's a couple of them on this that have different harnesses. Just lay that aside. Now we can see this is the collar that we're going to be removing. There's a spring right here, and there is a bolt here. All right, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to measure the depth between here and the end of this steering shaft so that when I get it back on, I can get it at the exact same distance. And I'm going to just do that with a plastic micrometer gauge. All right, so the distance between there and there is, see, 10, 11, 12 millimeters. So I'm just going to put that aside. I'm going to put a mark here on the dot. And then I'm going to make a mark here on the threads, and then another mark here. So I can pretty much get that back to where I need it. All right, now the hard part is to get this collar off. You've got to have a puller to do that. And I'm going to show you what I'm going to use next. All right, so I have the, this is a bearing splitter slash puller right here. I have it right at the back of the collar. All right, so these are some mighty big channel locks. And I'm going to try to counter hold this as I try to take this off. There we go. Okay, so it is pulling the collar off. Now there is another way to do this without pulling the collar off. You can drop the steering column down, but I think this is the easier way to do it. Okay. And the collar is off just like that. Okay, that's the collar. So this basically is an adapter. The Volkswagen, this model Volkswagen uses what's called a large steering hole in the wheel. This is the small one, so I don't know why they just didn't stay with the smaller one, but anyway. All right, so the next thing I need to do is remove this okay, that's out. I'm going to loosen or remove the harness connector in the back of the ignition switch. I'm going to remove the spring, and in order to get this off, you have to have the ignition switch to the on position. All right, so once you turn the ignition key on, you should just be able to pull this out. Now, I had to actually hit the end of this very lightly while I pulled this out because, well, it was a little stuck. Anyway, that's the ignition switch, okay? And this whole rigmarole we just went through is because of there's a little tiny screw right there. So what I'm going to do, let's go inside where it's cool, and I'll show you how to replace the switch itself. All right, so here is the new Volkswagen switch. Inside there you see that Phillips screw. I'm going to remove this. Maybe this is kind of like a anti-theft measure to have this screw, I guess, not accessible unless you pull this out. So Here's the old switch. Okay. And then here is the new switch. Go down like that. Okay, nice and tight. So now what was wrong with the old switch? I don't know. Probably something internally. But just make sure, take your key, make sure that the lock cylinder turns freely and springs back. Now this one feels much tighter than the old one. So let's go put this back in. Oh, I wanted to show you guys one thing. See this right here? This is the anti-theft device that prevents the steering wheel from being able to be turned when the key, see when you turn the key, it's all good, and then when you remove the key, that pops out and you can't turn the steering wheel. So if you guys ever wanted to know how that worked, that's how it works. It's fine until you take the key out. All right, so let's go back outside and stick this in. All right, so what I'm gonna do to put this back in is I'm going to put the key in, remember, to get that foot to re-engage back inside. And then slide this back on just like that. Okay, it can only go one way. Just make sure everything's still turns good. I'm going to replace this screw or the bolt. This locks this back to the steering column. So I'm just putting it on snug. Okay. All right, so one more time, make sure that this is very good action. Okay, next I'm going to put the harness, plug that back in, okay? All right, so now, next, we get to assemble everything back. Yeah, so first thing goes back is our spring. And next thing goes back is our collar. So I'm going to line this up as best I can. Let me see something. So with the spring on here, it's very, okay, I can push it in a little, I can see the line that I made, which is good. So I'm going to take the nut. Okay, so you should be able to do this by hand, like I just did. And I'm going to take the impact gun and just very lightly screw this down. Okay, right on the money. It's exactly 12 millimeters. Okay. Now, next thing we want to do is we're going to put all of our electrical components back on. So the first thing that needs to go back on is the windshield or the wiper assembly. Okay. All right. So that's the two connections. There's a red one on the bottom and a black one here. Now on this one right here, there's the large. Let's see. There's a 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 pin connector. And so we're going to put this on. So we'll go through like this. All right, now this one right here slid through like that, right? And then this plugged in like that, okay? This connector right here went down and hooked on there. There's a large connector back here that plugged in there. Now these two connectors right here plug in, and there is a slide, pardon me, that you can't see. That's right there. Okay. And then this last connector is for the airbag. All right, so just double check, make sure you've got everything connected, all right? We've got the main combo switch connector here. We've got the one here that slides on the retention underside, or the slide on the underside of the ignition switch. We've got the two connectors back here. Now, I'm going to go ahead and test the key again. Okay, that action feels very, very solid. Now I'm going to go ahead and screw these 3 screws back in. All right. All right, everything's good. Okay. All right, so the next thing we want to do is I want to take the steering wheel, back this out just a hair. I'm going to take the steering wheel and I'm going to go ahead and plug the connector up, the yellow connector here. All right. And then I'm going to attempt to line everything up. Okay, that looks perfect. I'm sure there's a torque value for this, but whoops. I don't know what it is at this time. Okay, now next is to reinstall the airbag. Now make sure that the power is still off. Do not connect the battery, because you don't want this thing blowing up in your face. Okay, see the steering wheel is locked. That's good. And it should easily unlock. I put the key in. Okay, so again, I'm gonna have the key in. I'm gonna turn the ignition to on, and we'll hook up the battery, and hopefully the airbag won't deploy. Shouldn't. That's a good sign. Let me tighten up the terminal. Okay, that's tightened up. All right, so I have everything back together. Let's see what happens. Crank right up. The Jetta is now, as you can see, my tack is going crazy. This thing has not, I haven't driven this since April. So I'm going to just let it run for a little while, and I've always kept it on a battery tender. But anyway, so that job is not I've got to open this door, it's hot. That job is not a super difficult job. The hardest thing is having that bearing splitter. I'm going to put a link in Amazon where you can get that kit. That bearing splitter / puller is key to getting the collar off. Okay, so that is the absolute best thing to use to get the collar off. Once you get the collar off, it's just a matter of disassembly and then putting the ignition switch on and reassembly. Now, there was nothing wrong with the key lock portion, so that's why we didn't mess with that. But I am very relieved and happy to get this back on the road, and hopefully I'll won't have any issues for the next, I don't know, we'll say 10 years. But anyway, guys, thank you very much for watching the video. Subscribe if you haven't done so, and I will see you guys on the next video. Yeah, that's 382,771 miles.